Good morning. It is
Hello.
June 18th, 2020. We're on episode 53.
All right.
Yeah.
53. Yeah, we'll be collecting Social Security soon,
hmm
before we know it.
Well, unless we postpone because it's a small amount and we want to get a better return. Wait till we're 68.
There we go.
That's a whole other topic we could discuss. It's retirement at the end of the age.
Yes.
Post-apocalyptic retirement strategies. But yeah, so for those who, I don't think we introduced ourselves yesterday.
We didn't. We were just on a roll right away.
For anybody who's watching who has no idea who we are, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination in Minneapolis.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And I'm actually at our Northwest Minnesota Retreat Center.
In the ugliest county.
Outside of, yes, the ugliest county in America. That's a whole other story. You can look that up. Red Lake County, Minnesota, and the Washington Post. And one of the interesting things about coming up here is that here the pandemic is totally over.
It's by God's miraculous fingers.
Yes,
tucked away the COVID-19.
Yeah, I've been running some errands, doing some things in Crookston, and I've been getting a lot of funny looks because I am the only person wearing a mask. And, people are hanging out at the bars, hanging out at the little bakery shop, all sitting next to each other, breathing on each other. Everything's fine. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, they're doing what they wanted to do to begin with, which was ignore the whole thing. Only now, I guess, they feel like they get to do it legally or something because we're opening up. So they have completely opened up. Which will be fine until there's a super spreader here. I was just reading an article about this tiny town in Oregon where 200 church members have now tested positive, and the county is freaking out because, they have no medical capacity there, basically, and it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yay. I mean, I'm hoping it doesn't happen. This weird phenomenon, like I hope it doesn't happen, but when things don't happen, then I'm like, man, the conservatives are going to think that they were right, but they just don't. Sometimes reality is so complex that it fits conservative predictions. It's true. It doesn't mean that their working model of how reality works is true. It's the broken clock.
Yeah, the broken clock thing. It's right twice a day. Anyway, we're going to dig a little deeper into this whole Christian backlash that is really gaining steam. I mean, it's like I'm seeing multiple articles every day to the Black Lives Matter phenomenon, the protests, all of this. And it's very, whoa, Mark is gone all of a sudden. Okay, I don't know what happened there. I don't know if I'm transmitting anymore.
I went away. I don't know what happened.
He's back.
Something got clicked. But yeah, you were saying we're talking about this backlash.
And so it's fascinating because it's being couched in a couple of different ways. One is in terms of the culture wars,
yes,
which is also building and brewing because of the two Supreme Court decisions in the last couple of days. One extending legal protection for LGBTQI workers, and then the other this morning vacating Trump getting rid of DACA. So it's being framed in terms of the culture wars, and then it's also being framed in terms of capitalism versus socialism and the evils of the left.
Yes. And, my favorite article, and I'm just going to name this, you can look it up if you really want to, but you don't need to because we're going to analyze and synthesize it for you. The Gospel Coalition, that bastion of intellectual girth, had an article that was released yesterday called "It's Time for a New Culture War Strategy" by Kevin DeYoung. Basically, it argues that, you know what, if we don't want to lose this thing, we need to have more kids and disciple the hell out of them, is basically what he says, which anytime people talk about we need to outbreed the opponents, that just sounds white supremacist to me. I don't think that's intentional, but necessarily. But it's this thing, like, for some reason, to me, like right away after, George Floyd was killed, there were a lot of people, including Rush Limbaugh, calling for the police to be prosecuted, right? And so there were a bunch of very evangelical, very conservative people saying, yes, hashtag Black Lives Matter. But then it got rolled back right away because it turns out that the people who primarily founded the kind of the umbrella organization for Black Lives Matter were two queer women, right? And so we can't support Black Lives Matter because they're too queer. And then you dig deeper and realize, oh, they did some analysis and they say that capitalism is intrinsically racist. And so they're not only queer, but they're socialists. And so we can't support Black Lives Matter because queer socialism.
Right. And not only can we not support it, but then a number of the articles are really saying that it's actually not about Black Lives Matter, right? That this is a cloak and dagger move to get queer socialists running the world. And what's interesting is all of the groups that get lumped in together. So one of my favorite ones, which I just laugh when I think about it. One of these articles was talking about the Ford Foundation as this far left radical organization, which, cannot be further from the truth, right? But what the Ford Foundation basically has done for decades now is simply support people getting an education, and so they're very classically middle of the road liberal. But again, what's interesting is that the evangelical movement has become so against even what we now consider to be basic education that they're even lumping a group like that in with this horrible tide of moral decay, I guess.
No, and it's there's a comment here. Please repeat the article name. Yes, it's called "It's Time for a New Culture War Strategy." It's on the Gospel Coalition website, and it was written by Kevin D. Young yesterday, June 17th.
Kathleen's got a comment.
Yeah, one of the laws of physics is that for every action, there's an equal reaction. I think it holds socially too. There sure tends to be. And it's weird to me because I grew up conservative, evangelical. There's some key ways in which I'm still an evangelical in the best sense of that term, because I still believe in a personal relationship with Jesus. I still believe in that can be transformative, a conversion. I believe in a lot of things. So there's nothing about evangelicalism intrinsically that means you have to be racist, anti-socialist, queer hating, like those sorts of things. And of course, a lot of people wouldn't spin it that way. That's how I'm spinning these things. But because evangelicalism has become locked in to a set of cultural assumptions that people don't even stop and analyze. And so this idea that somehow it is unchristian to support Black Lives Matter because of socialism and queerness is bizarre to me. And, of course, what ends up happening in these situations is evangelicals start scrambling for the three Black people that they trust to speak about this from a conservative perspective, and they parade them around. This is very cynically put.
Candace Owens, Ben Carson, and that sheriff from Milwaukee.
And then those are the three. And there's some seminary professors who are at very extreme conservative places that are like talk about racial justice, but they do it from a very conservative lens. And so one article I read was saying, hey, Black Lives Matter doesn't support Black lives because socialism and queerness are destroying Black culture. What we need is, if we really support Black lives, we will end Black on Black crime, which is a dog whistle. We will return fathers to their homes, and we'll become really law-abiding, law and order people. So really,
then did you see that one about Black men marching in suits?
I did not.
Yes. So the other day again, there was one of these very conservative groups that just said, well, if black men just wore suits, they would not be hurt by the police. So they actually had this rally and this march, and there's this picture. You can look this up again, and here are all these black men in suits, leading this march. And again, this is I'm going to keep pitching my systems class, sign up for it. So this is the individualistic versus the systemic view. In conservative circles, the whole thing is, black people would not get in trouble by the police if they just behaved properly.
They probably haven't.
And they were good fathers.
I mean, you can just look at pictures from the civil rights era of black men in suits getting attacked by dogs, or even watch the movie Selma, which is not, I guess maybe they think is leftist propaganda at this point. Yeah, well, or the fact that every time Martin Luther King gave a speech, including when he was assassinated, he was wearing a suit. So, so suits are not protective. All right, we got. Let's see. No, this is sharing this link.
Somebody shared the link.
Yeah, I'll put it up here. I don't know if you want it, but again, it's the Gospel Coalition .org, and it's a Kevin D. Young article. I'm not recommending it for anyone tuning in late as a positive thing. It just shows this logic of we can't, as evangelicals, we need to influence culture, and we do that through discipleship and by having more kids. Comment from Anthony. Important not to disconnect the response from the historical intertwining of right-wing conservatism and fundamentalist evangelicalism going back through Falwell, Reagan, and beyond, particularly in the mid-'80s. Yeah, and so this is the whole Southern strategy thing that really started picking up steam of linking certain kind of sentiments together into a block. So it wasn't like Ronald Reagan earlier on was pro-choice. Like this idea of using abortion and homosexuality as kind of like hinge pins for a strategy to kind of like make it a little easier to be racist by lumping these things together. And it really starts coalescing up until even in the 90s around this law and order kind of crap. Mm-hmm. So that anything that's seen to uphold the established social order as seen as good by conservatives is a Christian thing. Anything that undergirds that, like, so homosexuality and pro-choice stuff, they think threatens the family unit, which is sacred. Socialism threatens the established order of property rights and law and order as they see it. And of course, if you can somehow link that to, if you can somehow point out how Black leadership is part of this leftist cabal, then you can find a way to dismiss Black leadership without seeming racist. That seems like what's happening now. Yeah.
Well, and then, I mean, taking it even further back, I found that most Americans are not even aware of where fundamentalism came from, right? So this was something that was very specifically created in America in the very early 20th century, and it was a response to what was perceived as a threat by science on religion. So that's why it's very much tied into liberal education and liberalism. So evolution was gaining steam, scientific examination of scripture was gaining steam, and the church was feeling more and more threatened. And so this group of very prominent pastors got together and created this document that laid out the 7 fundamentals of Christian faith that could not be questioned. Right, so they were trying to create this wall. Trump isn't the first one to do a wall. I'm trying to do this with my hand so it goes evenly. There we go. This nice wall between science and faith. And so the 7 fundamentals could not be questioned. You just had to accept them. And they were things like the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection, inerrancy of scripture. Originally, it was the Westminster Catechism. When the Lutherans picked it up, it became Luther's Shorter Catechism. And these were things that you simply, substitutionary atonement, you couldn't question those. You couldn't examine them with the methods of science. And so that's where fundamentalism comes from. And And then as that picked up steam through the decades, all of these other things, it's sort of like this big ball that just picks up dust. It's this giant dust ball, began to attach to that. But the connection with education and anti-scientism, and this connects to a lot of what we're seeing with the pandemic, with global warming, is really at the heart of this. And so one of the things that's interesting, all across the South, you have a lot of public school districts that do not have a single white child in the school district. And they all go to these fundamentalist Christian schools, many of whom do literally not even teach any science classes. So you're also getting this whole generation that are completely unprepared to function in modern society. And so, we can sort of see where all of these threads then begin to connect and intersect with whatever modern issue comes up. All right, we're getting a lot of great comments.
Yeah, so it's
two-part. Throw them on up there.
Does it help, though, if we carry on the us versus them narrative? How can we get past that? By which I mean pitching leftist versus conservative Christians. I think it's complicated. Like, do I think us versus them narratives are generally good? Not exactly, but depends on what we replace it with. Because I don't think polarization is the worst bad. I think accommodating oppression is the worst bad. So there's ways in which people try to say, well, we've got to stop this polarization. So what we do is meet in some sort of moderate middle that ultimately reinforces the status quo, which is oppressive. And sometimes we have to be against things. Like, to me, the way I tend to slice and dice this, and of course, this is always hard to pull off, is like what Paul says. We don't struggle against people or flesh and blood. We struggle against principalities and powers. And we've got to be able to name accurately toxic systems and ideas. Now, should we throw every evangelical under the bus? No. I don't want. I want to name these problems of evangelical thought culture, while also recognizing that there are evangelicals who do not fit the description.
I think this is an important thing, and several people have brought this up at different points during the transmission. And so one of the ways that I look at this is to understand what is going on with the us versus them, right? I mean, so this is basically the ego process. It derives from our basic experience of reality, which is that we as individuals separate ourselves from the rest of the world, right? So it's the I, thou idea, right? There's me, there's the rest of the world. So that's this basic bifurcation that happens when the human mind arises. And so that then populates everything. And so everything, there's always two sides to an argument, right? And that's a manifestation of that. And so on the one hand, no, we actually don't want to continue that because that's part of the ego process. But on the other hand, the question is, do we actually engage with spiritual practice processes that get us beyond that? And then in the meanwhile, what Mark's talking about is very important. We have to name what's going on. Now, again, do we solidify that position and then, call people evil and treat them terribly? No. However, reflecting on what's really happening is very important.
Here's a follow-up to that particular question. Jeremy writes, is struggling against the principalities and powers just a liberal expression of love the sinner, hate the sin? Not exactly, but I mean, there's similarities. I mean, it's funny. This is how the Apostle Paul talked about it. So to me, that makes it very conservative. It's a systemic way of looking at it. So to me, the love the sinner, hate the sin thing is generally it's untrue. And it looks especially when it's used in the context of homosexuality, is used as a way of saying your self-perception is fundamentally flawed, and so we need to excise. It's almost it's a moralistic, individualistic way of framing it. Principalities and powers is a way of saying, look, there's these systems that become entrenched that are bad, and then individuals and groups within those systems need to be liberated from it. So it is like we need to love people, but recognize there's things affecting those people that are bad. That sense that it's a similar way of framing it. But one is very systemic and not really moralizing, and the other one is very moralizing. So
yeah, it totally depends on how you're using that particular statement.
Kate writes, can you explain why conservatives refuse to admit that systemic problems exist? Why do you think that every problem is only the fault of individuals? Or why do they think that it's only the fault of individuals?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, we actually talked about that a bunch, I don't know, 3 or 4 episodes ago, but a lot of it really arises out of their understanding of salvation, which is a very individualistic idea, right? And so it's between me and Jesus. Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, right? So even the way they've inserted that, Jesus isn't here to save the world. Jesus is here to personally save individuals. And then the theology kind of builds out from there. So everything is centered around, do I as an individual accept Christ as my Savior? So now I get the gold ticket to heaven. And the systems that I'm connected with really are kind of irrelevant, and so that then, as I said, builds as far as their analysis of almost all other problems and issues.
Well, and sometimes folks with that sort of way of looking at things have some systems analysis, but they assume systems are just the sum total of individual choices.
Right.
So what is usually being left out is this idea how determinative systems can be in your perception of things. And so, like, if you're not, this is why a lot of people will talk about stages of development and see conservatives as a lower stage of development. And I don't think it's very helpful to stay. It can be helpful as a metaphor sometimes, but I think it can break down pretty quick and be weirdly supremacist. But this idea that I think it's partially true that some conservatives just don't have a capacity to really understand the same issue from like a lot of different viewpoints at the same time. So there's kind of a myopia that lends itself to that, and which tends to, which I think a lot of people that aren't conservative have that too. But if you're in a culture that's very conservative and individualistic, and it's impossible for you even to imagine how you can look at it a different way, you get stuck pretty quick.
Right. Yeah, and so a great example of this is the idea that if everybody was nice and loving, racism would vanish from the United States. Right, which again is this, the system is simply the sum total of individual actions, and it does not have a corporate ego self that is operating within the landscape of society.
Well, and if you want, again, I'm going to plug this for Dan. Like, Dan is teaching a systems class about how to think about things systemically and how that shapes everything. You can go to the Minnesota Institute for Contemplation and Healing Facebook page, and also probably the website too, and you'll find it there. It's worth checking out. Maria writes, I responded this morning to a post similar in vein to the article. The attitudes in the article are like those of the priest and Levite who walked by on the other side of the road. The Good Samaritan left his compassion to drive his solidarity and actions. There is so much hypocrisy in being selective as to which issue one chooses to be publicly active about. Yes. Well, why is it these, it's usually the big call out against people who stereotypically hold the pro-life stance. Because pro-life means like a couple specific categories of people, but excludes other categories of people. And so usually the call out is like, why aren't you consistently pro-life? Why don't you care about the death penalty? Why don't you care about war? And so by focusing on the unborn, my conviction is that a lot of people think that they're really doing that from a compassionate place, but I have strong suspicions it's because the unborn can't speak, and so it allows you to use it as a leverage for whatever you want. Because if I've seen in every argument, like, You think you care about Black lives? What about the unborn Black lives? I'm the true social justice, compassionate person. So it just becomes this convenient lever to use to regulate everybody else.
Let's see, we skipped over. Anthony has a question here.
Oh, great. Thanks for pointing that out. Anthony writes, a major issue across the board in these kinds of conversations is a clarification of what we're trying to counter. What do we include or exclude as violence? And how do we include or exclude ourselves in that analysis? That's a big question.
Yeah, I'm not sure 100% of what you're trying to get at, but I think that, and again, coming from the spiritual life point of view and the connection of spirituality to activism means that one is always engaging in that personal reflection and transformation. And so, and again, this gets back to the us versus them and the softening of that and the letting go of that. One of the interesting experiences that I had along these lines, for almost a decade, I helped to direct a program where we were teaching youth ministers spiritual practices. And these were these week-long retreats, and we would get, between 30 and 70 of these folks together. And they were from all over the Christian spectrum. And we would joke that, at the beginning of the week, half the people in the room didn't think the other half were Christian. And we wouldn't let them talk to each other very much. And everybody was just doing a lot of contemplative practice and listening to one another. And then by the end of the week, they could finally kind of talk to each other. And one of the things that arose consistently at every one of these retreats was the fact that people began to appreciate each other and actually really soften on this us versus them stance that they came in with. And again, this wasn't something that we talked about at all. This was something that spontaneously arose that people would discuss by the end of it. So, yeah, I think that the holding these two things in front of us, right, the fact that we are always pushing towards ultimately a very open, totally inclusive place. And at the same time, living within the reality of this ego-constructed world and having to navigate that, those are both important aspects of the process.
Yeah, the bigger conversation of what constitutes violence or what constitutes oppression is a big one, and there's all sorts of takes one can have about that. And everybody has a tendency to have an ideological weak spot in vilifying other people's issues more than their own. So I think that's always a good call to have some self-interrogation. John writes, the personal Jesus. Excellent point. Jesus not saving the world, but the person. Systemic faults are then overlooked or dismissed. In fact, if the system exists, it's God ordained by its very existence. I'm not sure exactly what that last sentence is getting at. You can maybe flesh that out. But yeah, it's not like I'm against the person. Like the mystics, you could say, had a personal relationship with Jesus, but they didn't see it as all they had. So to me, it's this sort of collapsing everything into that. This almost this apolitical posture that ends up becoming toxically political.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it's a both and, right? So individuals do exist and have some degree of agency, but then systems also exist, and they have their own momentum and agency, and we have to. Again, to get a fuller picture of reality, we see both of these things, right? And again, if you look at, and a lot of people have talked about, the last book of the Bible, Revelation, in this way, it's, this is a reflection upon the individual person existing within the Roman Empire, and how is it that we do that? How is it that we do that as an individual? How is it that we do that as groups of churches, groups of people, as churches? And so that's really what we're talking about. It's not like, oh, the individual doesn't exist. No, the individual exists, and the individual is very much put upon by the systems within which we find ourselves and are formed by. Yeah. And so we engage both of those.
I want to just add a couple things that tie into the systems thing and also the sort of us versus them. I think one of the couple mistakes happen when people try to reconcile this tension is they try to say, well, both American conservatives and American liberals are right. We need to bring both those together into one whole, just as they are. That's a mistake because they're both problematic. And so we have to have a system, we have a way of thinking that takes the wisdom of both and puts it into a holistic way of seeing things, but it doesn't mean you can just slap two American streams of thought together and equal a whole. The other thing is people often assume that American, like Democrats, are systems thinkers, and then American conservatives are individualistic thinkers. Most Democrats are individualistic thinkers too. Right. So especially, you notice, like anytime someone says something racist on TV, which I'm not for, by the way, they usually get scapegoated as a way of, instead of dealing with the system. Democrats tend to be moralistic too. Like most Americans tend to be individualistic and moralistic.
Yeah. I mean, most individuals. Yeah, I mean, most Americans, we're trained in individualistic thinking. It has nothing to do with what our political view is. All right, so we're coming to the end, but Anthony does mention one really good book here. If you have not seen this,
Ties into
Spiritual Bypassing.
Yes, Robert Augustus' master's work on spiritual bypassing, espousing spiritual and religious rhetorics while ignoring the personal involvement in structural and systemic responsibilities.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's you can also Google spiritual bypassing. There's a lot of people have written about it, but that book is particularly good and helpful.
That's really good. All right, Ellen gets the last word. Hey, Ellen, by the way, where are the raccoons? I haven't seen them yet.
The raccoon horde is still coming.
Yeah, it's still coming. All right.
If you don't get that, go listen to our conspiracy theory episode. Bifurcation of soul and body, an arbitrary hierarchy, beginning with the early church fathers, became a deep root for Christian supremacy. We got to go way back to dig this weed out. Amen.
Nice. Awesome.
Good final word.
All right. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be with you. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you all. See you tomorrow.